The silence of orbital station Kepler 442 had become Carter Voss's closest companion over the past 3 weeks. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a library or the comfortable hush of dawn breaking over Earth's horizon. This was the hollow, echoing silence of abandonment, the kind that pressed against your eardrums and made you question whether you were still breathing. Carter adjusted the wrench in his calloused hands and wiped sweat from his brow as he worked beneath the station's primary life support panel. The diplomatic crisis between Earth and the Volari Consortium had escalated faster than anyone anticipated, and when the evacuation order came through, somehow his name had been missed on the manifest. Or maybe it hadn't been missed at all. Maybe they'd simply decided that one maintenance technician wasn't worth the fuel costs for another transport. System diagnostics complete, the station's AI announced in its maddeningly cheerful voice. Atmospheric processors operating at 67% efficiency. Recommend immediate maintenance attention to sectors 4 through 9. Yeah, well, get in line, Carter muttered, tightening another connection. The station was falling apart around him, and he was just one man with 2 hands trying to hold together a facility designed for a crew of 40. He'd rationed the food carefully, but even with the hydroponic garden still functioning, he had maybe 2 months before things got dire. The communications array had been damaged during the evacuation scramble, leaving him unable to send distress signals beyond the local system. For all practical purposes, Carter Voss was the loneliest human in the galaxy. The irony wasn't lost on him that Kepler 442 had been humanity's greatest diplomatic achievement, a neutral meeting ground built in the orbit of a dying red giant, equidistant from Earth and Volari space. Now it was his tomb, slowly decaying as its host star continued its ancient death spiral. Carter had just managed to coax another 5% efficiency from the atmospheric processors when the proximity alarms began their urgent wailing. He nearly dropped his tools, scrambling to the main observation deck. Ships didn't come here anymore. The treaties were dead, the diplomats had fled, and the star's radiation made it increasingly dangerous for prolonged visits. Through the reinforced viewport he saw it, sleek, crystalline, and utterly alien, a Volari diplomatic vessel, its bioluminescent hull pulsing with soft patterns of blue and silver. It was smaller than the massive transport ships he'd seen in the archives, clearly designed for speed and stealth rather than cargo capacity. "This is impossible," he breathed, watching as the ship executed a perfect docking maneuver with Port 7. The Volari had been as eager to abandon the peace talks as humanity. What could possibly bring one of their diplomats back to this forgotten corner of space? The docking sequence completed with mechanical precision, and Carter found himself face to face with a choice that terrified him more than the prospect of dying alone. He could hide, pretend the station was truly abandoned, and avoid whatever political complications this visit might bring. Or he could do his job, maintain the station, protect its neutrality, and face whatever came through that airlock. His hands shook as he straightened his worn jumpsuit and tried to smooth down his unruly brown hair. 3 weeks of minimal grooming hadn't done him any favors, but there wasn't time for vanity now. The airlock was cycling through its sequence, and in moments he would meet the first living being he'd seen since the evacuation. The inner door slid open with a soft hiss, and Carter's breath caught in his throat. She was tall, nearly 6.5 feet, with the characteristic elegant proportions of the Volari. Her skin had the subtle iridescent quality of her people, shifting between pale silver and soft pearl as she moved. She wore formal diplomatic robes in deep midnight blue, cut in the flowing style that somehow managed to look both practical and ceremonial. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Volari eyes were legendary throughout human space, large, expressive, and capable of shifting through the entire visible spectrum depending on their emotional state. Hers were currently a deep violet blue, with flecks of gold that seemed to dance in the station's artificial lighting. They regarded him with cool assessment, showing no surprise at finding the station occupied. "I am Lady Kessa Andra Velthara, of the 3rd Diplomatic Circle," she announced, her voice carrying the musical quality common to her species. "I have come to finalize the terms of the Kepler Accords as previously arranged. You are not the negotiator I was expecting." Carter realized he'd been staring and managed to find his voice. I'm Carter Voss, Station Maintenance. I'm afraid there's been a situation. The diplomatic teams were evacuated 3 weeks ago due to the crisis. I'm the only one left. Her expression didn't change, but he caught a subtle shift in her posture, the first crack in her diplomatic composure. The only one on the entire station? Yes, ma'am, just me and a whole lot of broken equipment. For a long moment, they stood there in the airlock antechamber, two representatives of species on the brink of war, separated by politics and biology, but united in their isolation. Lady Cassandra's eyes shifted toward a deeper blue, and Carter wondered what that meant in Valari emotional language. I see, she finally said. This complicates matters considerably. Carter had tried to make the station's guest quarters as comfortable as possible for Lady Cassandra, though comfortable was relative when half the environmental systems were running on backup power. She'd accepted the accommodations with diplomatic grace, but he could see the subtle tension in her shoulders as she surveyed the flickering lights and jury-rigged repairs that kept their little corner of space habitable. For 3 days, they maintained a careful distance. She would emerge from her quarters at precisely 0800 station time, nod politely if their paths crossed, and spend her days in what had been the main conference room, presumably working on diplomatic documents that would never be signed. Carter went about his maintenance routines, fixing what could be fixed and documenting what couldn't. It was a strange dance of avoidance, made stranger by the fact that they were the only two conscious beings within several light years. Carter found himself unconsciously timing his work to catch glimpses of her. The way she moved through the corridors with fluid grace, never hurried, but never casual. How she would pause sometimes at the observation windows, staring out at the dying star with an expression he couldn't read. Her eyes would shift colors throughout the day, deep blue during her formal work periods, lighter silver when she thought no one was watching, and occasionally a warm amber that seemed to indicate some kind of contentment. On the 4th night, everything changed. Carter was outside the station, tethered to the hull and working on the primary solar collection array. One of the panels had been damaged during the evacuation, and the power loss was becoming critical. The work was delicate. One wrong move could leave them in darkness, but it was also strangely peaceful. Out here, surrounded by the vast emptiness of space, he could almost forget about the war brewing between their peoples. The dying star painted everything in shades of deep red and gold, and Carter found himself thinking about home. Not Earth necessarily, but the concept of home, a place where you belonged, where someone waited for you, where your absence would be noticed and mourned. The view is quite remarkable from here. Carter nearly jumped out of his magnetic boots. Lady Cassandra had emerged from the airlock behind him, now wearing a sleek environmental suit that somehow managed to look elegant, even in the harsh vacuum of space. Her helmet's faceplate was clear, revealing those extraordinary eyes now shifted to a warm gold green. Lady Cassandra, you shouldn't be out here without. I am fully qualified for EVA operations, she interrupted gently. My people spend considerable time in space. I was curious about your work. She moved closer, her magnetic boots clicking against the hull as she found secure footing. This close, Carter could see her face clearly through the helmet. Could see the way the starlight played across her iridescent skin. It's mostly just maintenance, he said, turning back to the solar panel. Not very exciting. Yet essential, she observed. Without your work, we would both be dead within days. There was something in her tone, not quite admiration, but a recognition that surprised him. In his experience, diplomats rarely acknowledged the people who kept the lights on. They worked in companionable silence for a while, Cassandra holding tools and providing an extra pair of hands where needed. Carter found himself relaxing in her presence, the careful diplomatic distance replaced by something more natural. When she handed him exactly the right tool before he asked for it, he caught himself smiling. There, he said finally, watching as the repaired panel began collecting energy again. That should buy us another few weeks. Weeks? Her voice carried a note of something he couldn't identify. You speak as though this situation is temporary. Carter, looked at her through their helmet faceplates, suddenly aware of how alone they truly were. Isn't it? I mean, someone will come for you eventually. Your people must know you're here. The colors in her eyes shifted to a deeper blue, sadness he was beginning to realize. They believe I am completing the final negotiations for the Kepler Accords. When I return empty-handed. She trailed off, turning to look at the distant stars. What will happen? Disgrace, exile most likely. My family has served in the diplomatic corps for 12 generations. I will be the first to fail so completely. The weight of her words settled between them like a physical presence. Carter had been so focused on his own abandonment that he hadn't considered hers might be voluntary, or that it might carry consequences far worse than simple isolation. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't realize. She turned back to him, and in the starlight her eyes had shifted to that warm amber again. It is not your fault, Carter Voss. You did not start this war. The way she said his name with that musical Valari accent made something flutter in his chest. They were floating in the vacuum of space, tethered to a dying station orbiting a dying star, and somehow this felt like the most intimate conversation he'd ever had. We should head back inside, he said reluctantly. The radiation levels spike during the star's active periods, but neither of them moved. They stood there on the hull, two figures silhouetted against the cosmos, and Carter found himself really looking at her for the first time, not as an alien diplomat or a political complication, but as a person, someone beautiful and brilliant and desperately alone. Her helmet's heads-up display cast a soft glow across her features, highlighting the elegant curve of her cheekbones and the way her lips curved in what might have been the beginning of a smile, but it was her eyes that captured him completely, shifting now through shades of gold and green and something that might have been silver, reflecting not just the starlight, but something deeper. Your eyes, he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. They're beautiful. The change was immediate and startling. Her eyes widened, cycling rapidly through colors he'd never seen before. Rose gold, soft lavender, warm coral, and her skin beneath the helmet's lighting shifted to an unmistakable flush of deeper silver. She was blushing. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the space between their helmets, the vacuum around them suddenly feeling charged with possibility. Carter realized he'd never seen a Valari blush before, hadn't even known they could. The diplomatic briefings had mentioned emotional displays but described them as carefully controlled ceremonial things. This was neither controlled nor ceremonial. This was raw, genuine, and utterly beautiful. She began, then stopped, her voice catching in a way that had nothing to do with the comm system. No one has ever. My people do not speak of beauty in such terms. Then your people are missing out, Carter said softly. The moment stretched between them, fragile and profound, until the station's automated systems chimed a warning about radiation levels. They made their way back inside in silence, but something fundamental had shifted. As they went through the airlock decontamination sequence, Carter caught her watching him with those extraordinary, ever-changing eyes. And for the first time since he'd been stranded, he didn't feel quite so alone. The next morning brought a subtle but unmistakable change to their dynamic. Cassandra appeared at Carter's usual breakfast time in the small galley, carrying what looked like a formal diplomatic data pad, but wearing an expression of studied casualness that somehow made her seem more alien than her exotic appearance ever had. I have completed my review of the treaty documents, she announced, though her eyes, currently a soft green blue, kept darting to the simple meal Carter was preparing. The terms are no longer relevant. I'm sorry to hear that, Carter said, adding extra portions to his breakfast without asking if she wanted any. He'd noticed she'd been eating very little from the diplomatic rations she'd brought, probably trying to preserve them. Must be frustrating, coming all this way for nothing. Perhaps not for nothing, she said quietly, then seemed to catch herself. The journey has been educational. Carter slid a plate across to her. Reconstituted eggs, hydroponic tomatoes, and what passed for coffee on a space station. She regarded it with curiosity rather than distaste, which he took as a good sign. Educational how? She took a careful bite, her expression brightening slightly. Your food has more complexity than I expected. Valari nutrition is efficient but rarely pleasurable. She paused, as if she'd revealed something she shouldn't have. And the solitude allows for contemplation impossible in diplomatic circles. Contemplation about what? Many things. Her eyes shifted to that warm amber he was beginning to associate with her more relaxed moments. Tell me about Earth, Carter Voss. What is it like to live on a world with weather? The question surprised him, but something in her tone, genuine, curiosity mixed with what might have been longing, made him set down his fork and really consider the answer. Chaotic, he said finally. Beautiful and terrible and completely unpredictable. I grew up in the Rocky Mountains, and every morning, you'd wake up not knowing if it would be sunny or snowing or somewhere in between. You had to be ready for anything. That sounds terrifying, she said, but her eyes had shifted to an excited silver. Sometimes, but also amazing. There's this feeling you get when a storm breaks and the sun comes out and everything smells like rain and growing things and you realize you're part of something so much bigger than yourself. He trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. Sorry, I'm rambling. No, she said quickly. Please continue. My world has controlled weather, controlled everything. We have eliminated uncertainty. Do you miss it? Uncertainty? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Her eyes cycled through several colors before settling on a deep blue that Carter was learning meant she was thinking seriously about something. I did not know it was possible to miss something I had never experienced, she said slowly. But sitting here, listening to you describe your mountains and storm, yes, I think I do miss it. Their conversations became a daily ritual after that. Carter would work on the station's endless maintenance needs, while Cassandra observed, asking questions that revealed both her sharp intelligence and her growing fascination with human culture. She wanted to know about music, about art, about the concept of career choices made for passion rather than predetermined genetic aptitudes. In return, she began sharing stories of Valari society that painted a picture far more complex than the diplomatic briefings suggested. She spoke of family obligations that stretched back generations, of emotional restraint valued above personal happiness, of a culture that had achieved perfect order at the cost of spontaneity. Do you ever wish you could just choose something different? Carter asked one afternoon as they worked together to repair a water recycling unit. Choice is an illusion, she replied automatically, then paused, wrench halfway to a connection. Or so I was taught, but being here, watching you work not because you must but because you care about keeping us alive. Her eyes shifted to that warm amber again. Perhaps choice is more real than I believed. The moment of vulnerability hung between them until Carter accidentally dropped his tool, the clatter breaking the spell. As he bent to retrieve it, their hands brushed and he felt the warmth of her skin through their work gloves. She didn't pull away immediately, and when he looked up, her eyes had shifted to that coral rose color he'd seen during their first EVA. Cassandra, he said softly, using her name without the formal title for the first time. Yes? Are you happy? I mean, generally with your life? The question seemed to surprise her more than any technical inquiry about human culture. She was quiet for so long that Carter began to think he'd overstepped some boundary, but finally, she answered, Happiness was not a consideration in my life plan, she said. Duty, honor, service to my people, these were the measures of a worthwhile existence. That's not what I asked. Another long pause. No, she whispered. I do not think I have ever been happy. The admission seemed to shock her as much as it did him. Her skin shifted to that deeper silver flush, and her eyes cycled rapidly through colors he was still learning to interpret. I'm sorry, Carter said. I didn't mean to. Do not apologize, she interrupted. You asked a question I have never been asked before. The answer is illuminating. That evening she joined him in the observation lounge as he performed his nightly check of the exterior sensors. The dying star painted everything in shades of red and gold, and the silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. "Carter?" Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Yeah? When you said my eyes were beautiful." She paused, and he could see her struggling with something. "Among my people, physical compliments are reserved for formal ceremonies or genetic evaluations. They are not given freely or without purpose. What's your point?" "What was your purpose?" Carter considered lying, giving her some diplomatic answer that would maintain the careful distance they'd been pretending to maintain. Instead, he found himself being honest. "No purpose. I just thought you should know." "Thought I should know that you find me beautiful?" "Yeah." The word hung in the air, between them like a challenge. Cassandra turned to face him fully, and in the starlight her eyes were cycling through a rainbow of colors: confusion, wonder, something that might have been fear, and underneath it all, a warm golden glow that made Carter's heart race. "My people would say that such thoughts are inappropriate between representatives of species in conflict," she said carefully. "Probably. What do you say?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dying star. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I say that I have never felt more alive than I do when you look at me like that." Carter's breath caught. "Like what?" "Like I am not a diplomat or a political symbol or a genetic specimen. Like I am simply me." She turned to face him again, and her eyes had settled into that warm amber that seemed to indicate contentment. But there was something else there now, something deeper and more complex that made Carter's pulse quicken. "Cassandra, I know this is complicated," she said quickly. "I know there are consequences, but I find myself caring less about those consequences every day." "What are you saying?" She reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement, and placed her hand over his where it rested on the observation window's sill. Her skin was warm, almost fever-hot compared to human normal, and he could feel the subtle electric tingle that all Valari possessed. "I am saying that for the first time in my life I want to choose something for myself, rather than for duty or honor or family expectations." Her eyes met his directly. "I want to choose you." The confession hung in the air between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Carter felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared into Cassandra's eyes, watching the colors shift and dance in patterns he was only beginning to understand. Her hand remained on his, warm and electric, and he could feel her trembling slightly. "Cassandra," he said softly. "Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back." "I have been thinking of little else for days," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "In my culture, we are taught that emotional attachments are weaknesses to be overcome. But when I am with you, I feel complete in a way I never have before." Carter turned his hand over, threading their fingers together. The gesture was simple, but her eyes widened as if he'd performed some kind of magic. "Among my people, we call this holding hands," he said gently. "It's a sign of affection, of connection." "Connection," she repeated, testing the word. "Yes, that is what I feel. As if we are two parts of the same whole." The romantic tension that had been building between them for days finally reached its breaking point. Carter lifted his free hand to her face, tracing the elegant curve of her cheek with his fingertips. Her skin was incredibly soft, with a warmth that seemed to come from within, and she leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. Her eyes shifted to that deep coral rose color, and her skin flushed silver across her neck and cheeks. "When you say such things, I feel as though I'm discovering myself for the first time." "Maybe you are," Carter said, leaning closer. "Maybe we both are." Their first kiss was tentative, exploratory, a question asked and answered in the space between their lips. Cassandra's mouth was warm and sweet, and when she sighed softly against him, Carter felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what it meant to be alive. When they finally broke apart, her eyes were glowing with colors he'd never seen before, deep golds and warm crimsons that seemed to come from her very soul. I have read about human kissing, she said breathlessly, but the descriptions were quite inadequate. Carter laughed, the sound surprising them both with its joy. Everything's better in person. Indeed, she agreed, then grew serious. Carter, I must tell you something. If my people discover what has happened between us, the consequences will be severe. For both of us. What kind of consequences? Exile at minimum. Possibly worse. My people believe that emotional attachments to other species are not just inappropriate but dangerous. They would see this as contamination of my genetic and cultural purity. Carter felt a chill run down his spine. And what do you think? I think, she said, moving closer until their bodies were nearly touching, that I have never felt more purely myself than I do in this moment. The days that followed were a revelation for both of them. Their relationship deepened with each shared meal, each quiet conversation, each moment of physical closeness. Cassandra was a quick study in human expressions of affection, delighting in simple gestures like hand-holding and gentle kisses that her people would have considered primitive. In return, she taught Carter the subtle art of Velari emotional communication, how the shifting colors of her eyes and skin reflected not just her feelings but her deepest thoughts and desires. He learned that the coral rose color meant she was falling in love with him, that the warm amber indicated perfect contentment, and that the deep crimson that appeared when they were alone together meant she wanted him in ways that transcended the merely physical. Their first night together was a revelation wrapped in tenderness. Carter had been working late on the environmental systems when Cassandra appeared in the engineering section, wearing nothing but a simple sleeping gown that somehow managed to make her look both vulnerable and breathtakingly beautiful. The Siu loneliness is becoming unbearable, she said simply. I do not wish to spend another night alone. Carter set down his tools and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. Are you certain? We don't have to rush anything. I am certain, she said, her eyes shifting to that deep crimson that made his heart race. I want to be with you, Carter, completely. He led her to his quarters, the small space made intimate by the soft lighting and the distant hum of the station systems. When he kissed her, she melted against him with a soft sound of pleasure that sent heat racing through his veins. Their lovemaking was a careful exploration of differences and similarities. Her skin was warmer than his, almost fever-hot in her arousal, and it shifted through colors that painted their joining in hues of passion and wonder. She was responsive and eager, her body moving against his with a natural rhythm that spoke of desires long suppressed. You are magnificent, she whispered against his ear as they moved together, her voice breathless with wonder and need. So are you, he replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. Afterward, they lay entwined in the narrow bed, her head on his chest and her skin glowing with a soft golden light that seemed to come from within. Carter traced lazy patterns on her back, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. I never understood why humans valued physical pleasure so highly, she murmured, her voice drowsy with satisfaction. Now I think perhaps you are the wiser species. It's not just the physical part, Carter said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. It's the connection, the intimacy, the feeling that you're not alone in the universe. Yes, she agreed softly. For the first time in my life, I am not alone. They spent the following days in a haze of newfound love, stealing moments together, between Carter's maintenance duties and Cassandra's increasingly futile attempts to maintain her diplomatic facade. They made love with growing passion and tenderness, learning each other's bodies and souls with equal devotion. Cassandra proved to be an eager student of human culture, particularly the aspects that emphasized individual choice and emotional expression. She asked endless questions about Earth customs, about the concept of marriage for love rather than genetic compatibility, about the idea that two people could choose to build a life together regardless of their backgrounds. On my world, she told him one evening as they shared dinner, partnerships are arranged by the genetic council based on optimal offspring potential. Love is considered a pleasant but unnecessary bonus. That sounds horrible, Carter said, And she laughed, a sound that never failed to make his heart skip. It is efficient, she corrected. But you are right that it is also horrible. I have watched my parents live in perfect emotional isolation for 3 centuries, and I swore I would never accept such a fate. Is that why you became a diplomat? To avoid an arranged partnership? Partly. Diplomatic service allows for delayed reproductive obligations. I thought I was buying myself time to find an alternative. Her eyes shifted to that warm amber. I never imagined the alternative would find me. It was during one of these intimate conversations that the station's communication system crackled to life for the first time in weeks. Both of them froze as an authoritative Valari voice filled the comm center. Lady Cassandra Velthara, this is Commander Thal S. of the diplomatic vessel Serene Purpose. We have received no communication from you in 7 days. Please respond immediately. Cassandra's skin went pale silver, and her eyes shifted to that deep blue that Carter had learned meant fear. The outside world had finally found them, and with it the end of their perfect isolation. They have come for me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Carter felt his heart sink, but he kept his voice steady. What do you want to do? She looked at him with eyes that held all the colors of love and loss and desperate hope. I want to choose you, she said firmly. Whatever the consequences, I want to choose you. But even as she said the words, they both knew that the choice might no longer be theirs to make. The next 6 hours were the longest of Carter's life. He and Cassandra barely spoke as they watched the Valari ship approach through the observation windows, its crystalline hull gleaming like a weapon against the star-painted darkness. She had responded to Commander Thal S. with diplomatic efficiency, requesting additional time to complete her mission analysis, but they both knew it was only a delay. What will you tell them? Carter asked as they stood together in what might be their final private moment. The truth, she said, though her eyes were cycling through colors he'd never seen before, deep purples and silver grays that spoke of internal turmoil. That the treaty negotiations are impossible under current circumstances. Not about us? She was quiet for a long moment. I do not know if I am brave enough to tell them about us. Hey, Carter said gently, turning her to face him. Whatever. You decide, I'll support it. If you need to go back to your life, to your people, no, she interrupted fiercely, her eyes flashing to that deep crimson. I will not pretend that what we have found together is meaningless. I cannot go back to the half-life I was living before. But I am terrified, she admitted. My people do not forgive what they see as betrayal. If I choose you, I choose exile from everything I have ever known. Carter cupped her face in his hands, feeling the familiar warmth of her skin and the subtle electric tingle that marked her as utterly alien and utterly precious to him. And if you don't choose me, then I live the rest of my life knowing that I was a coward when it mattered most. The docking sequence began with mechanical precision, each clang and hiss of the airlock bringing them closer to a moment that would define both their futures. Cassandra dressed in her formal diplomatic robes, the midnight blue fabric making her seem both beautiful and untouchable. Carter stood beside her in his maintenance jumpsuit, feeling inadequate and determined in equal measure. The inner airlock door slid open, revealing 3 figures in elegant Valari diplomatic dress. Commander Thal S. was tall even by Valari standards, with the silver-touched skin that indicated advanced age and the cold, pale eyes of someone accustomed to absolute authority. He was flanked by 2 younger diplomats, both regarding Carter, with expressions of thinly veiled disdain. Lady Cassandra, the commander said, his voice carrying the formal tones of high diplomatic protocol. We have come to escort you home. The Council has need of your services in more productive negotiations. Commander Thal S., she replied, inclining her head with perfect diplomatic courtesy. I was not expecting extraction so soon. Your prolonged silence was concerning, he said, his eyes shifting from pale blue to silver as he assessed the situation. And your companion was not mentioned in your diplomatic briefings. Carter Voss is the station's maintenance chief, Andra said smoothly. He has been instrumental in maintaining operational capacity during my stay. Carter felt the weight of 3 alien gazes settling on him like a physical pressure. He straightened his shoulders and met the commander's stare directly, refusing to be intimidated despite the diplomatic gulf between them. Indeed, Thalas said coldly. How convenient that you are not evacuated with the rest of your species. Sometimes things fall through the cracks, Carter replied evenly. Sometimes, the commander agreed, but there was something in his tone that suggested he didn't believe in coincidences. One of the younger diplomats stepped forward, a female with the elaborate braided hair that indicated high family status. My lady, the ship is prepared for immediate departure. We should begin the extraction sequence. Of course, Cassandra said, but Carter caught the subtle hesitation in her voice. Actually, she continued, and Carter felt his heart stop. There has been a development in my situation that requires discussion. The temperature in the airlock seemed to drop several degrees. Commander Thalas's eyes shifted to a pale, cold silver that Carter was beginning to recognize as the Valari equivalent of barely controlled anger. What kind of development? Cassandra straightened, and Carter saw the moment she made her choice. Her eyes found his, shifting to that warm amber that meant contentment and decision, and she smiled with a courage that took his breath away. I have decided to remain on the station. The silence that followed was deafening. The commander's skin went pale white, and his eyes became so light they were almost transparent, a level of shock and fury that needed no translation. That is impossible, he said finally. You have duties, obligations, family honor to consider. I have considered them, Cassandra replied calmly, and I have chosen something else. You have chosen? The younger male diplomat spoke for the first time, his voice dripping with disbelief. You speak as if you have the right to choose. I do, she said firmly, and I choose love. The word hung in the air like a confession and a challenge. Carter felt his heart swell with pride and terror as he watched the woman he loved take the most courageous stand of her life. Commander Thalas's composure cracked completely. Love? With this human? He spoke the word like a curse. You would disgrace 12 generations of your family for the sake of primitive emotional attachment? I would honor them by finally living a life of meaning and joy, Cassandra replied. Something they never had the courage to do. The commander stepped closer, his presence radiating menace. You will return to the ship immediately, or you will be declared exiled from Valari space permanently. There will be no return, no forgiveness, no contact with your family or people ever again. I understand the consequences. Do you? The female diplomat joined the confrontation. Do you understand that you will be genetically isolated? That any offspring you might produce will be considered contaminated? That your very existence will be erased from our records? Carter saw Cassandra flinch at that, but she didn't back down. I understand. And for what? Commander Thalas demanded. For the fleeting affection of a short-lived species on a dying station orbiting a dying star? For the chance to be happy, Cassandra said simply. For the chance to choose my own fate instead of having it chosen for me. The commander studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. Very well. By the authority vested in me by the Diplomatic Council of the Valari Consortium, I hereby declare Lady Cassandra Velthara exiled from Valari space, stripped of rank and family name, and severed from all ties to our people. His voice carried the weight of absolute finality. You are no longer Valari. The words hit like physical blows, and Carter saw Cassandra stagger slightly. But then she straightened, her eyes shifting to that brilliant crimson that spoke of love and determination, and she reached for Carter's hand. Then I will be something new, she said, threading their fingers together. I will be someone who chose love over duty, happiness over honor, and the future over the past. The 3 diplomats turned and began walking toward their ship without Another word. But at the airlock threshold, Commander Thales paused and looked back. "The station's supply ship will not be returning," he said coldly. "You will die here, both of you, forgotten and alone." "No," Carter said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. "We'll live here together and we'll be remembered by each other. That's enough." The commander's expression didn't change, but Carter thought he saw something flicker in those pale eyes, perhaps the faintest hint of envy for the courage they'd shown. The airlock sealed with mechanical finality, and within minutes, the Volari ship had detached and disappeared into the star-painted darkness. Carter and Cassandra stood together in the sudden silence, hands clasped and hearts racing. "Well," Carter said finally, "that could have gone worse." Cassandra laughed, the sound bright with relief and residual terror. "How could it possibly have gone worse? They could have tried to take you by force." "True." She leaned against him, and he felt some of the tension leave her body. "Carter, what have we done?" "We've chosen each other," he said, wrapping his arms around her. "Everything else, we'll figure out as we go." She looked up at him, her eyes cycling through every color, of love and hope and determination. "Do you think we can make this work? Two people alone on a dying station?" Carter looked out at the dying star, at the vast emptiness that surrounded them, at the woman in his arms who had given up everything for the chance to be with him. The future was uncertain, probably short, and definitely challenging. "I think," he said, kissing her gently, "that we're about to find out just how powerful love really is." Outside the observation window, the dying star pulsed with ancient light, and for the first time since Carter had been stranded, it didn't look like an ending. It looked like a beginning. The hydroponic gardens had never been more productive. Carter smiled as he harvested tomatoes that had grown fat and red under Cassandra's careful tending, her intuitive understanding of plant biology having revolutionized their food production. What had started as a desperate survival measure had become something approaching abundance. "The communication array is functioning again," she called from the control center, her voice carrying that note of satisfaction he'd grown to love. "I've managed to boost the signal strength by 30%. Carter found her surrounded by circuit boards and diagnostic equipment, her hair tied back and her face smudged with the honest dirt of technical work. She'd traded her diplomatic robes for practical jumpsuits months ago, but she'd never looked more beautiful to him. "Any responses to our distress beacon?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "3 different ships have acknowledged." "Receipt," she said, leaning back against his chest. "A human merchant vessel, a Centauri research team, and—" She paused, her eyes shifting to that warm amber. "A group of Volari exiles who heard about our situation through underground channels." "Exiles? It seems we are not the first to choose love over duty," she said softly. "There are others like us scattered throughout the galaxy, building new lives away from the restrictions of our birth cultures." Carter felt a surge of hope and excitement. The prospect of rescue had always been bittersweet. They'd built something precious in their isolation, and he'd feared that returning to civilization might destroy it. But the idea of joining a community of others who'd made similar choices— "What do you think?" he asked. Cassandra turned in his arms, her eyes cycling through shades of gold and green and coral rose. "I think," she said, standing on her toes, to kiss him, "that we've proven love can survive in the most impossible circumstances. Perhaps it's time to see if it can thrive in possible ones. Together, always together," she confirmed, her skin flushing that beautiful silver that still made his heart race after all these months. Outside their window, the dying star continued its ancient dance, but it no longer seemed like a symbol of ending. It was simply the light by which they'd found each other, and by which they'd continue to build whatever came next. The universe was vast and uncertain, full of dangers and wonders they couldn't yet imagine. But they would face it all together, 2 hearts that had chosen to align like binary stars, creating something new and beautiful in the darkness between worlds. And in the hydroponic gardens, the tomatoes continued to grow fat and red, nourished by recycled water and artificial sunlight, and the radical idea that love could bloom anywhere, even in the most impossible places. The end. When stars align,